So we talked a little bit about this idea that in human decision making, there's oftentimes too much information, not the right information, and that we face this problem of sort of cognitive overload. And so I'd like to talk a little bit about common shortcuts that get used in terms of trying to navigate the complexity of decision making. So we talked a little bit about this, but I want to sort of return to this idea of polyheuristic decision making, because I think it's a really useful framework for thinking about that sort of balance of how human beings manage complexity and yet sort of map onto that sort of a veneer of procedural rationality. So polyheuristic theory means poly, many, like polygon, I guess, and heuristic is a Greek word for shortcut. And so it's decision making that involves many shortcuts that help us to whittle away the complexity. And we use sort of non-rational shortcuts as well as some rational shortcuts to sort of pare away things that we just don't have the ability to really dig into, that we think we don't need, that we're not going to pay attention to, so that we're left with a subset of information, a subset of options that we can then evaluate and sort of analyze with a level of rigor that looks kind of like what we would talk about when we're talking about rational decision making. And so the example that I oftentimes use is, how do you select a restaurant for where you want to eat? Very rarely do people, pull up the master list of every restaurant in their city. Instead, there's usually a conversation about, what kind of food do you want? Do you want pizza, tacos, burgers? Chinese food, what kind of food are you interested in? We sort of whittle away the things that we don't want in sort of a big picture swath. And then we sort of narrow it down and say, oh, okay, so we'd like pizza. Well, here's 5 different pizza places that are in town. Which of the 5 do we want to order from? And that can be more of a rational conversation that balances cost versus speed versus cheese content versus coupons. I don't know what all of your criteria would be. But that polyheuristic process allows for us to be systematic while simultaneously just dismissing whole swaths of possibilities. One place where this comes into play a lot, and I think we really see the application of polyheuristic decision-making by leaders in foreign policy situations, is with analogies. And with analogies, leaders are looking at past events to try to make sense of new scenarios. And so the analogy that's maybe the most famous that people oftentimes hear about refers to a meeting in Munich, Germany in the lead up to World War II, where Neville Chamberlain goes to Munich to meet with Hitler. And Hitler says, I just need you to allow me to seize part of Czechoslovakia, the sort of historically German-ish part. And once that's done, Germany will be satisfied. Germany will make no more demands of its neighbors. Germany will have achieved sort of a nation state status, and that will be the end of it. And Neville Chamberlain returns to Great Britain with a piece of paper signed by Hitler saying that, if Britain supports Hitler's annexation of part of Czechoslovakia, that will be the end of it. Well, it wasn't the end of it. Hitler sort of moves into the rest of Czechoslovakia, and then he moves on Poland. And the lesson that many people take from this experience of Munich is that you can't negotiate with dictators. The dictators, like the sort of children's story, if you give a mouse a cookie, once you appease a dictator, once you provide them with something, they will make additional demands, assuming that you will just cave the next time. And so again, that's a story that leaders sort of told themselves about how to respond to dictators, that allowed for them to not analyze every single situation independently, but to sort of go in with sort of a preset model about how to analyze and think about that situation. And while leaders oftentimes will select analogies from their own lifetime, I think it's worth pointing out that leaders also oftentimes select the wrong analogy or an inappropriate analogy. And in my lifetime, the most glaringly horrific example of this was the occupation of Iraq, where L. Paul Bremer, the State Department official who was tasked to sort of oversee the occupation and reconstruction of Iraq following the US invasion in 2003, got on a plane for Baghdad loaded with books about the US occupation of Japan and the US occupation of Germany after World War II as successful examples of how to do occupation correctly. But both Japan and Germany at the end of World War II were There were nation states. There was a sort of a unified national identity. There was industrialization. There was a functioning state that had just been defeated totally in war, versus Iraq, which was a fractured society, with Sunni and Shia and Kurds, that had been brutalized by Saddam Hussein, and maybe didn't have the same precursors of industrialization, that Germany and Japan had to sort of benefit from and stabilizing the country. And so these were very different kinds of scenarios. And yet L. Paul Bremer comes in with the idea that the most important thing that the United States can do is to de-Ba'athify the country. And so one of the first things that he does is essentially fires all the people, all the officer corps, the folks who know where the guns are at and where the munitions have been stored, and says, you're out and you're not going to get your, retirement that you were promised, and you have no place in modern Iraqi society. And the result of that was the launching of the Iraqi insurgency by disaffected Sunni officers who have been purged as part of this de-Ba'athification effort. So analogies can be helpful, they can be effective, but they only work if they're relatively appropriate for the situation. Hastet, our textbook, really spends a lot of time talking about analogies. This is one of the things that Hastet really likes, and so he digs into some of the additional problems that we see with analogies. One of the things he flags is that we focus on the big events, right? We focus on the things that were, cataclysmic, that loom large in our imaginations, but we miss the fact that for every cataclysmic outcome, there were maybe a dozen, maybe 24, maybe 100 similar kinds of situations that weren't cataclysmic, right? And so this is called the problem of focusing on the dog that barks rather than the dog that didn't bark, right? That there can be lots of dogs, lots of situations, lots of problems that never rise to the level of anybody paying attention. There are, there's only one Vietnam, but there's lots of situations that didn't turn into a quagmire. And so Hastet is skeptical that we really select anecdotes that are, or analogies that are representative of broader patterns because of this dynamic. He also notes that when we're trying to work through analogies and we're trying to understand sort of historical reasoning, we oftentimes make some pretty damning mistakes in terms of how we work with history. And so one of those is that we ignore why something happened or why something worked, and we simply focus on the what. And I'll maybe add this in with the third piece of attributing outcomes to big actions and not the details and the careful planning. And one example I think is useful here is looking at the failed raid launched by the Carter administration to rescue American hostages that were being held in Iran shortly after the Iranian Revolution, when Iranian students stormed the US Embassy in Tehran. Carter launched a rescue mission that he was thinking would be an Entebbe type raid. And he was making an explicit reference to a raid that was launched by Israeli forces on an airport in Uganda a few years earlier, where the Palestinian Liberation Organization had seized hostages, and the Israeli special forces went in and freed hostages from this group. One of the things that really made the Entebbe raid successful was that the PLO had released a group of hostages, and one of the folks that they had released had, I believe, special forces training, and had essentially memorized the entire layout of the airport, had done a systematic sort of memorized analysis of the hostage takers, their weaponry, where they were positioned. And so the Israeli forces that went in had this incredibly detailed picture of what they were going into and what they were facing that allowed them to be successful. The raid into Tehran was cataclysmic on a variety of levels. There were mechanical issues with helicopters and weather issues, but also there just wasn't the sort of detailed knowledge about what they were going into and what they were facing. And those kind of differences really matter, but oftentimes leaders don't focus on, do we have the same kind of information? Are we in a similar kind of situation to actually execute this? They're simply focusing on that sort of headline outcome of what happened. The other problem that Hastet really hones in on is that when we're evaluating past events, we oftentimes want to classify them as successes or failures. And he says that's not the right metric. And we've kind of flagged this before when we've talked about policy evaluation, that a good policy moves us in the direction that we want to go, that it might not be possible to get everything that we want. A good policy sort of balances the costs versus the benefits and nudges the ball forward as best we can. It may not be possible in some situations to get everything that a country is desiring, and a good policy might look like a failure in hindsight if you're not understanding the complexities and limitations of that situation. And so again, I think that's a useful thing to keep in mind, that a policy that didn't work could still be as good a policy as you could have pursued given the constraints you face. A last piece that I want to kind of add in here is something that Robert Jervis has brought up in his analysis of how leaders use analogies. And he's noted that leaders have many possible analogies that they can draw on, many possible things from their own life that might help point the way forward. People tend, he argues, to select analogies and stories that serve their own interests or maybe take them in the direction that they want to know, what they want to go. And so given that there's that possibility, right, that it's not the analogy that tells us what to do, but that we know what we want to do and we find an analogy that justifies our choice, it's really hard to sort of parse out how much of this is maybe imperfect reasoning on the part of leaders, of they grabbed an analogy and they misunderstood the situation, and as a result they didn't get the outcome they wanted, versus they got the exact outcome that they wanted. They knew that they wanted that policy and they were just looking for some way to justify it, and they picked an analogy that wasn't an appropriate analogy, or they weren't applying appropriately, but that wasn't the point. It was really just sort of a ex post facto rationalization. And I think that that's a useful sort of thing to kind of keep in the back of our mind when we hear leaders tell stories about why they did what they did. Leaders may be trying to retroactively impose the illusion of reasoned thought versus impulsive reaction.